I'd like you all to patronize me with a thinking exercise. I'd like you to consider what Canada is to you. When you see this flag behind you, what comes to mind? For many of you, there's the idea of Canadiana, mountains and beavers and maple syrup and hockey. And for me, certainly there is my favorite Tim Hortons donut with a chocolate glaze. But for me, being Canadian also means thinking twice about how I come across to other people. As a Muslim man, when I advocate, does that make me an aggressor? Does that make me a stereotype where anybody else around me becomes a victim? For me, being Canadian means thinking twice of whether I should be going to the mosque, whether I should find a place to pray that's quiet, because if it was public, I might be criticized or attacked. For me, being Canadian is certainly a sense of pride, but it is also a sense of danger in who I am. For many people, their identity of being Canadian depends very much not just on what we think is typically Canadian, but on their experiences. And for many Indigenous Canadians, certainly this is the image of Canada. So, how is it possible that in a country so vast where we seem to come together, that our experiences are not bridged? How is it possible that we can carry on with two stark realities? We think to ourselves, well, Canada is certainly a very multicultural country. So, how is it that people who are marginalized, who people come from cultural communities, don't have a greater sense of inclusion? And the reason being for that is because not only is the experience of being Canadian based on our experiences, it's based on what we are told it is. And we are told Canada is multicultural. And yet the truth is we are unicultural. And I want to prove that to you because I'd like you to think for a moment. What would a typical Canadian cultural event be to you? Think of the images that come to mind. And for many of us, it would be a hockey game, cheering on our team, feeling really proud. Or would it perhaps be a powwow? I can tell you, this is not the first thing that comes to mind. And for many of us, we might have a secondary thought where we consider this an Indigenous cultural event as a Canadian cultural event. Sure enough, we might have a totem pole show up in Canadiana somewhere, but this is not the primary thought. When we start to think about what early Canadians look like, is this what comes to mind? Because I can tell you that wasn't the case for me. When I first moved to Canada as a 7-year-old boy, my image of what early Canada looked like and what an early Canadian family looked like, or more importantly, the quintessential Canadian family, it looked like this. And most of us were educated with the impression that these were the pioneers of Canada instead of people like this. And so we are told things. We are told to believe things, and that shifts our thinking. And I would ask you, if you were to consider what a typical Canadian family looks like now, a modern Canadian family, would you think of a family like this? Very relatable, even for people of color? Or would you think of a family like this? You see, the Ufsel family was murdered by a white Canadian terrorist who drove them over with a car. But every aspect about who they are is not necessarily represented as Canadian. Their ethnicity, their clothing, their culture, their religion, that's not represented. We are not told that's Canadian. And as a result, thinking becomes a very slippery slope because the person who murdered them did not see them as local. He saw them as foreign. And so many of you say, well, I would never drive anybody over with a car. That's not where my thinking is going. But as I said, as a psychologist, I tell you that thinking is a slippery slope. In Nazi Germany, It was actually neighbors who turned on other neighbors because they were told what was meant to be classically German. And I myself remember watering my plants in a backyard and thinking to myself, I wonder how much longer I can live in Canada, because the government at that time was thinking of establishing a tip line for people who practiced barbaric cultural practices, which was code for Muslims. This is my home. This is where I live. And already the government was getting ready to have neighbors report on other neighbors in the same way that occurred in Nazi Germany. Many of us carry thoughts that differentiate between who is local and who is foreign. That impacts our hiring policy. That impacts social services. That impacts our legal system. That impacts technology. It impacts entertainment. The difference between local and foreign is a very clear line between white and non-white. Now, you might not believe me, but I'm going to prove it to you, because you see, just a few weeks ago, I launched a tool called the Bias Outside the Box tool, testbias.com. And we asked people to respond to visual pictures of people. And I'm not giving you the exact questions because I'd like you to go and fill it out. But when you have these two pictures of two people, and I were to ask you who's Canadian born, you can think what you like, but I can tell you that the preliminary results say that we should actually be pointing towards the white woman. The white woman is Canadian born. And if I presented to you the exact same photographs and I said, who's the immigrant, I can tell you the preliminary results tend to point towards the South Asian man in his cultural garb. What does that say? You know, the actual truth is the white woman is actually the immigrant. And the South Asian man, who's actually the vice president of the Royal Bank of Canada, he's the local person. And so what that says to you is that we have a way of thinking. We've been indoctrinated into a way of seeing the world where we see people who are white as local and people who are not white as foreign, including Indigenous people. I remember a story in my mind of an Indigenous Muslim woman who stepped out of her door wearing a hijab, and a group of men drove by her in a truck and they said, "Go back to your country." And she's like, "I am in my country." So what influences that thinking? Why is it that we're having these results that people see white people as local and those who are not as foreign? And I would argue that it's propaganda. Now, you remember that photograph I showed you earlier of what we thought were pioneers? That's actually from Nazi propaganda, showing the quintessential Aryan family. And images like this still exist today. We think that we're past that. We think we're past Nazi Germany. We're in 2021. It's going to be 2022 soon. We are well past that. Well, I got news for you. That is not the truth. You see, Nazi Germany had all these kinds of propaganda where they displayed strong white features of Aryan people. Now, let me ask you a question. If we still had the same kind of advertising, but we just kind of painted over the swastika, what if the message was subliminal? Would that still be propaganda? Would that still impact our thinking? Well, William Shakespeare said, what's in a name? That which smells like a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet. And I would argue that white supremacy still smells the same. Our cultural heroes, our icons, still blonde goddesses from an Aryan nation. Yeah, sure, we have a few black superheroes, but they're tokenistic and patronized. The Black Panther still has an African accent. You have to fake that because he wasn't actually African. Strong Aryan features. Do they resemble anything with Nazi propaganda? Because to me, they do. Because I see this every day. My kid sees this every day. It impacts his thinking every day. And people of color doubt themselves. They second guess themselves. They second guess their standards of beauty. They second guess their abilities, they second guess their place in this world because of propaganda like this that does not represent people of color as well as it should. Our celebrities, over and over and over, and even our culture. Even our culture. And you might say, well, you know what? These are Oscar winners, by the way. Oscars have been criticized for being Oscars so white because it shows white people as being superior. The winners, the best actors are white. There's no people of color in there. What does that mean? It sends a message. You say, well, that's the States, you know. We can look down our noses at Americans to say, we're better than that. We're better than that. Look, our culture is far better. So if you think about the quintessential Canadian culture and we think about hockey, this is the national Canadian hockey team from 2021. All white faces. I don't see a single face of color in that picture. But many of us will work towards inclusion. We'll say, we're working towards inclusion because we're working on integrating women. We're doing a good job. Well, here's the women's hockey team. There's one black woman struggling to get into the photo in the very back, if you can see her. Not a single person of color in Canadian culture at all. Not only is Canadian culture reflective of a white way of being, but even in that way of being, there is no room for people of color. And anybody who plays hockey will tell you that it's largely a white sport. Any person of color, any Indigenous person that tries to get into hockey will tell you that that culture is stonewalled in whiteness. There's research that actually talks about how when we think leadership, we think white. Here you have the prime ministers of Canada, all white, one woman not elected, all white men. If that's not propaganda, I don't know what is. We have no swastika, but to me, the message is exactly the same. Now, here's the interesting thing. In our bias tool, when we had people of color, women of color, particularly here, dress in Western garb, and you would ask now who's the immigrant, things get a little bit more blurry. People still are probably more inclined to pick the white woman, but because a woman of color has adopted quote unquote Western dress, you've adopted that culture. You see, you're let in a little bit. If you let go of your identity, if you let go of who you are, maybe we'll let you in. And so sure enough, in this kind of a question, the woman of color is seen as a highly qualified medical professional. When we actually look at the other photographs, they are actually people of color in cultural dress. They are not seen as qualified medical professionals. To me, that's striking, and it speaks to not just about the need for representation visibly in terms of people of color, but also culturally. Are we integrating culture into Canadian society? Are we integrating multiculturalism into Canadian society? And I would argue that we're not. In fact, when you step up to be who you are as a cultural individual that doesn't fit with the whiteness of culture, you're actually squashed back down. If you're a woman who wears the hijab or the niqab, there's actually a law against that here in Canada that states the state has a role in telling a woman what to wear. You cannot wear that because it does not fit with what we consider secular norms or values. Any other country, we're here criticizing Afghanistan, and here in Canada, the state tells a woman what to wear. Indigenous people, when they stand up for their culture, when they try to protect their land, what happens? That's their culture. They get squashed back down. Come on, man, get with the times. Indigenous culture, that was based a long time ago. No, 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 no. If you want to be Canadian, you got to set with the times. And they squash back down. And so when we talk, we are blamed. We become the angry people of color. I become the angry Muslim. I become confrontational. We didn't mean that. I'm not racist. And you put your finger on people of color repeatedly, over and over and over again. And it shows up particularly with the culture of holidays. This Parliament building in Ottawa, which is meant to reflect every single Canadian, including the nearly 1 in 3 Canadians who's a person of color or an Indigenous person, another 1 in 3 who do not come from a Christian background. What do? We cast a Christian holiday, even if you don't celebrate it religiously, all over that. Do we do this for other color? Do we do this for other cultures? We do not. We don't do it for any other culture. But that, to me, is white supremacy at its best. That, to me, is the propaganda that perpetuates the thinking, that promotes racism and the elevation of people who we consider to be local, which is white, and people who are foreign, or people of color, and a disparity between those two groups of people. So what do we do? What's the solution? The solution is about representation. We need to go out of our way. We need to go beyond tokenism. I don't want a handout. I want what's mine. I want to be entitled. I want to be as entitled as an average white person to ask for what I want and what I need and what is my Canada. I want people to know about me. I want people to consider me Canadian. I want people to consider me local because I am. This is my home. I'm fighting to make my home my home. And when we stand up for it, when we fight against what it is, what are we told? You're being a Grinch. And did you know that the symbol of the Grinch, and actually even Ebenezer Scrooge, was based on anti-Semitic sentiment? Don't believe me? Because why would you be fighting Christmas? Christmas is exactly what you need. The money-grubbing Ebenezer Scrooge with a hooked nose. Does that stereotype sound familiar? Who doesn't celebrate Christmas? More Nazi propaganda where we blame. It's his fault, it says in German. It's his fault. So if there's discord in society, it's for those people who are standing up for their rights to make their home their home. So what's the answer? The answer is this: defund Christmas. I did a podcast on this. You won't believe the feedback I got. People very angry. Other people of color who celebrate Christmas. What do you mean defund Christmas? How dare you take away Christmas? You know what the irony is? Defund Christmas doesn't mean taking away Christmas. It means spread it out. Let's celebrate other things. The irony is that all these other cultural and ethnic groups in Canada don't have their holidays represented at all. We're not even taking anything away. It just never existed. But you threaten taking away Christmas. Put on a black Santa. Holy shit. You've got Armageddon. So my question to you is, how are you going to be integrating representation? Not just ethnically, but I mean culturally, in your everyday practice that's not tokenistic. How are you going to move forward in a way that changes your view and people's view of Canada so that Christmas is just as Canadian as Diwali, as Rosh Hashanah, as Eid, as Lunar New Year, as National Indigenous Peoples Day? So we're not just remembering the loss, but we are celebrating the presence of our current Indigenous communities. And so my goal to you, and I'd ask you to check this out. If you go to winlove.ca, you'll see this tip. And I'm encouraging people to celebrate everything with the same vigor that we would Christmas, with the same days off that we would have for Christmas as well, too. Thank you very much for tuning in to my message of what I think Canada should be, a home for all of us.